My son called me an embarrassment at his wedding and hid me from his rich in-laws, who work for the company I secretly own. Welcome to Revenge Galore. If you crave real gripping stories where justice hits hard and betrayal never goes unpunished, this channel is your new favorite place. Please subscribe. My name is Desmond Chole, and for 67 years I thought family meant something. I've spent the last 43 years working as a senior facilities supervisor at Riverside Manufacturing in Toledo, Ohio. Every morning at 5:30 a.m., I drive my 2019 Toyota Camry to the plant, put on my work boots and make sure everything ran smoothly. I wasn't the guy in the corner office wearing $1,000 suits. I was the man who kept the lights on, the machines running, and the workers safe. But what my family never knew, what my ungrateful son Trevor never bothered to ask about, was that I didn't just work at Riverside Manufacturing. I owned it. For 4 decades I'd maintained the perfect cover. Modest house in a working-class neighborhood. Sensible car. Clothes from department stores, not boutiques. I packed my lunch in a metal box and ate bologna sandwiches while secretly reviewing quarterly reports that showed my company generating $180 million in annual revenue. The deception wasn't about shame or false humility. It was about watching people's true character emerge when they thought you had nothing to offer except sweat and sacrifice. Trevor Chole, my 33-year-old son, had benefited from every penny I'd earned through blood, sweat, and strategic business decisions. Private elementary school at St. Catherine's Academy, $15,000 per year for 8 years. High school at prestigious Brookfield Preparatory, $28,000 annually. His MBA from Northwestern University, $120,000 in total costs that I paid without blinking. Every achievement Trevor celebrated, every door that opened for him, every opportunity that launched his career as a financial consultant, all of it funded by the simple factory worker he'd grown increasingly ashamed to call father. The transformation had been gradual but devastating to watch. In elementary school, Trevor would beam with pride when I attended his school events. "This is my dad. He runs the whole factory," he'd tell his classmates. Back then, being the son of a supervisor seemed impressive to 8-year-olds whose fathers worked desk jobs. But as Trevor grew older and his social circles became more sophisticated, I watched his pride turn to embarrassment. High school brought friends whose fathers were doctors, lawyers, and business executives. College introduced him to classmates whose families owned vacation homes and country club memberships. Graduate school connected him to a network of young professionals whose idea of modest means was a salary that exceeded what most factory workers made in 3 years. With each milestone Trevor achieved, I became more of an inconvenience in his carefully curated life story. The woman who would become my daughter-in-law exemplified everything Trevor aspired to be. Victoria Pemberton came from the kind of old money family that traced their wealth back 5 generations. Her father, Harrison Pemberton III, owned Pemberton Holdings, a real estate investment firm that managed commercial properties across the Midwest. Her mother, Catherine, served on the boards of 3 different charity organizations and had never worked a day in her life. Victoria was beautiful, educated, and absolutely convinced that marrying Trevor represented a step down the social ladder she was graciously willing to take because she loved him despite his background. The engagement had been announced 18 months ago at a dinner party at the Pemberton estate in the wealthy suburb of Ottawa Hills. I'd been invited, grudgingly, and spent the evening watching Victoria's family treat me like an interesting specimen they were too polite to study openly. "So, Desmond," Harrison Pemberton III had said during cocktails, "Trevor tells us you work in manufacturing. That must be satisfying work." The pause before satisfying said everything about what he really thought. "It has its rewards," I'd replied simply, sipping the bourbon that probably cost more than most people's weekly grocery budget. Catherine Pemberton had been even more direct. "We're just so impressed with how Trevor has made something of himself. It shows real character when someone can rise above their circumstances." Rise above their circumstances. As if providing my son with the best education money could buy, supporting his dreams and working 60-hour weeks to ensure he never wanted for anything constituted circumstances he needed to escape. But I'd smiled politely and nodded, just as I'd done countless times before when people underestimated the simple factory worker standing in front of them. The wedding planning had been an exercise in subtle humiliation disguised as generosity. Victoria's family insisted on handling most of the arrangements since they understood these kinds of events better. The ceremony would be held at Maumee Bay Resort, with a reception for 300 guests in the grand ballroom. The budget exceeded $150,000, not including the honeymoon to French Polynesia or the down payment on the newlyweds' house in the prestigious Westgate neighborhood. Trevor had approached me about financial contributions with the awkward discomfort of someone asking for a loan they weren't sure they could get. "Dad, I know this is expensive and I don't want to put any pressure on you. Victoria's family is handling most of it, but if you could help with anything, maybe the rehearsal dinner or the flowers, it would mean a lot." What Trevor didn't know was that I'd already prepared a wedding gift that would make the Pembertons' contributions look modest by comparison. A trust fund worth $2.8 million, carefully invested and legally structured to provide Trevor and Victoria with financial security for the rest of their lives. Plus the deed to a lakefront property on Lake Erie that I'd purchased 3 years earlier, a vacation home worth $650,000 that came with its own private beach and boat dock. The documents were signed, notarized, and ready to be presented during my speech at the reception. It would be my way of showing Trevor that his simple factory worker father had managed to build something substantial despite never wearing expensive suits or joining country clubs. But as the wedding approached, I began to notice things that made me question whether Trevor deserved the generosity I was planning to show him. 3 months before the ceremony, I'd stopped by his apartment to drop off some family photos Victoria had requested for a wedding display. Trevor wasn't home, but I'd used the spare key he'd given me to leave the photos on his kitchen counter. That's when I overheard a phone conversation that would haunt me for weeks. Trevor was on his balcony talking to someone I couldn't see. But his voice carried clearly through the sliding door he'd left partially open. "No, Mom's not the problem," he was saying. "She gets it. She knows how to dress appropriately, how to act around Victoria's family. It's my dad that I'm worried about." I froze, standing in his kitchen with a box of family photos in my hands. "He's going to show up in one of those cheap suits from Sears, probably tell some story about fixing a machine at the factory, and Victoria's parents are going to think we're, I don't know, some kind of charity case." The voice on the other end said something I couldn't hear, but Trevor's response was devastating. "I love him, obviously. He's my father. But love doesn't change the fact that he's embarrassing. Victoria's already nervous about introducing him to her business school friends. Her dad made some comment about blue-collar values last week, and I could tell he was being polite." I'd left the photos on the counter and walked out of Trevor's apartment feeling like I'd been punched in the stomach. The son I'd sacrificed everything for, the boy I'd worked double shifts to support, the young man whose education I'd funded by driving used cars and living in a modest house. He was ashamed of me. But that conversation was nothing compared to what I discovered 2 weeks before the wedding. I'd been at Riverside Manufacturing late on a Friday evening, reviewing the quarterly financial reports in my real office, the one on the executive floor that my employees knew about but my family had never seen. The building was mostly empty except for security and the night maintenance crew. I was preparing to leave when I heard voices in the parking lot below my window. Looking down, I saw Trevor and Victoria standing beside her BMW, engaged in what appeared to be an intense conversation. They were directly under the streetlight, and with my window cracked open for air circulation, their voices carried clearly in the quiet evening air. "I still think we should have seated him at a different table," Victoria was saying. "Your father doesn't exactly fit in with my family's business associates." "Victoria, he's paying for the rehearsal dinner," Trevor replied, but his tone suggested he agreed with her concern. "We can't just hide him in the corner." "I'm not saying hide him. I'm saying be strategic about placement. My father's investors will be at table 4 and your dad." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "Let's just say he doesn't speak their language." Trevor was quiet for a moment before responding. "After the wedding, things will be different. Once we get settled, we won't have to include him in everything. Victoria's dad already said he might have some opportunities for me at Pemberton Holdings. We'll have our own social circle." "Exactly," Victoria agreed. "And your mother seems lovely. She'll adapt. But your father, he's always going to be a factory worker, Trevor. That's not going to change." "I know," Trevor said quietly. "I've accepted that." I'd stood at that window for 20 minutes after they drove away, processing what I'd heard. My son had already written me off as a social liability. He was planning a future where his embarrassing father would be gradually excluded from family events and milestones. The boy I'd raised, educated, and loved unconditionally had decided I wasn't good enough to be part of his new life. That night, I made a decision that would change everything. I called my attorney, Bernard Hawkins, who had been handling my legal affairs for 15 years. Bernard was one of the few people who knew the truth about my financial situation, and he'd helped me structure my assets to minimize taxes while maintaining the privacy I valued. "Bernard," I said when he answered his home phone, "I need to make some changes to my estate planning. Specifically, I want to establish some conditions on the gifts I've prepared for Trevor's wedding. What kind of conditions, Desmond? The kind that can be revoked if certain circumstances arise. Bernard understood immediately. After 40 years of legal practice, he'd seen plenty of families destroyed by ingratitude and greed. I'll draft some paperwork that gives you complete discretion over the distribution of assets. If you decide Trevor hasn't earned what you've prepared for him, everything can be redirected elsewhere. Good. And Bernard? I want everything documented. If this goes badly, I want proof of every penny I've spent on Trevor's behalf, every sacrifice I've made, every opportunity I've provided. I want a complete record. Consider it done. 3 days before the wedding, I received a phone call that completed the picture of Trevor's ingratitude. My sister Margaret, who lived in Columbus, had been invited to the ceremony along with her husband Robert. Margaret had always been close to Trevor, and he'd often confided in her about things he wouldn't discuss with me. Desmond, Margaret said, her voice tight with anger, I need to tell you something Trevor said to me yesterday. I probably shouldn't, but I can't stand the thought of you walking into this wedding blind. My stomach nodded. What did he say? He asked me to talk to you about your behavior at the reception. Specifically, he wanted me to make sure you wouldn't embarrass him during the speeches or when you're introduced to Victoria's family. I sat down heavily in my kitchen chair. He asked you to manage me? That's not even the worst part. He said Victoria's father had made some comment about working-class relatives and how they sometimes don't understand appropriate behavior at formal events. Trevor wanted me to coach you on proper etiquette. The humiliation was complete. My son had recruited my own sister to treat me like a child who couldn't be trusted to behave appropriately in public. Margaret, I said quietly, don't worry about coaching me on etiquette. I think I'll manage just fine. Desmond, I'm so sorry. I don't know what's gotten into that boy. You've given him everything, and this is how he repays you. Don't apologize. You did the right thing by telling me. Now I know exactly where I stand. That night, I called Bernard Hawkins one more time. Bernard, I want you to prepare 2 sets of documents for tomorrow. The first should be the original trust fund and property transfer I had planned for Trevor. The second should redirect everything to the scholarship foundation we discussed. Are you sure about this, Desmond? Once you make this change public, there's no going back. I've never been more sure of anything in my life. The morning of Trevor's wedding dawned clear and cool, perfect October weather for an outdoor ceremony at Maumee Bay Resort. I dressed carefully in my best suit, a navy blue Brooks Brothers that I'd purchased specifically for this occasion. It wasn't custom-tailored or from an exclusive designer, but it was well-made and appropriate for the event. I arrived at the resort 2 hours early, ostensibly to help with any last-minute preparations. In reality, I wanted to observe the final preparations and see how Trevor's new family treated the embarrassing factory worker on their important day. Victoria's family had taken over the resort's executive suite as their preparation headquarters. When I knocked on the door to offer assistance, Catherine Pemberton answered with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Desmond, how thoughtful of you to check in. I think everything is under control, but thank you for offering. She was clearly hoping I'd take the hint and leave, but I persisted. Is there anything specific Trevor needs help with? I'm happy to handle any logistics. Oh, that's so sweet. But Victoria's cousin Bradley is coordinating everything. He's very experienced with these kinds of events. She paused, studying my suit with barely concealed assessment. That's a nice suit, Desmond. Very appropriate. The condescension was breathtaking. She was complimenting me like a child who had managed to dress himself properly. I found Trevor in the men's preparation room, adjusting his bow tie with the help of his groomsmen. When he saw me, his expression shifted almost imperceptibly, a micro-expression of anxiety that I'd learned to recognize over the past few months. Dad, you look great. Thanks for getting here early. His groomsmen, college friends and professional colleagues, greeted me with polite interest. They were clearly trying to place me in the social hierarchy they understood, and factory worker didn't fit comfortably into their framework. Mr. Chole, said one of them, a young man named Preston who worked in private equity, Trevor tells us you're in manufacturing. That must be interesting work. It has its moments, I replied. I've been with the same company for over 40 years. Wow, said another groomsman. That's real loyalty. You don't see that much anymore in today's economy. They were speaking to me like I was a fascinating relic from a bygone era, the last of a dying breed of workers who stayed with one company their entire careers. What they didn't realize was that my loyalty was really ownership and my company was a business empire I'd built from nothing. 2 hours later, as guests began arriving for the ceremony, I positioned myself in the resort lobby to observe the social dynamics at play. The Pemberton family's guests arrived in luxury vehicles, BMWs, Mercedes, and Tesla sedans that they handed off to valet attendants. They wore designer clothes and carried themselves with the confidence that comes from inherited wealth and social position. Trevor's guests, friends from college and graduate school, colleagues from his financial consulting firm, represented new money and professional achievement. They drove nice cars and wore expensive clothes, but they lacked the casual arrogance of the Pemberton crowd. And then there were my guests, my sister Margaret and her husband Robert, a few colleagues from Riverside Manufacturing, and some neighbors from my working-class neighborhood. They arrived in practical cars, wore their best clothes, and clearly felt out of place among the country club crowd. The contrast was deliberate and devastating. Trevor had essentially created a visual representation of the social hierarchy he was climbing, with his father's side representing everything he was trying to leave behind. But the moment that crystallized everything came during the pre-ceremony cocktail hour. I was standing near the bar, making small talk with Margaret and Robert, when I overheard a conversation between Victoria and one of her sorority sisters. "Victoria, your dress is absolutely stunning," the friend was saying. "And Trevor looks so handsome. You make such a perfect couple." "Thank you, Rebecca. Everything's going exactly as planned." Victoria paused, then added in a lower voice, "Well, almost everything. We had to be a little creative with the seating arrangements." "What do you mean?" "Trevor's father is, well, he's very sweet, but he doesn't really fit in with our usual crowd. We seated him with some family friends who are used to dealing with different types of people." "Different types of people?" "As if I were some exotic species that required special handling." "Oh," Rebecca replied, understanding immediately. "That's thoughtful of you. It's nice when families can accommodate everyone despite differences." "Exactly. Trevor's very close to his father, of course, but we want everyone to be comfortable." I excused myself from Margaret and Robert and walked outside to the resort's terrace, needing air and space to process what I'd heard. The October wind off Lake Erie was cold and sharp, matching my mood perfectly. Standing there, looking out at the water, I realized that Trevor hadn't just outgrown me, he'd actively repositioned me as a charity case in his new life. Someone to be managed, accommodated, and carefully contained so I wouldn't embarrass the real family he was joining. That's when I made my final decision. The gifts I'd prepared, the trust fund and property transfer that would have set Trevor up for life, would not be presented tonight. Instead, I was going to give him something much more valuable, the truth about what he was throwing away. The ceremony itself was beautiful and perfectly executed. Victoria looked radiant in her designer gown, Trevor appeared confident and happy, and the 300 guests provided an impressive backdrop of social and economic success. I sat in the designated section for Trevor's family, a group that included my working-class relatives and a few family friends who seemed as out of place as I felt. During the exchange of vows, I watched my son promise to love, honor, and cherish Victoria for the rest of his life. He spoke about building a future together, about sharing dreams and supporting each other through whatever challenges life might bring. His words were heartfelt and sincere, but I couldn't help wondering if he'd show Victoria the same loyalty he'd shown his father when she became inconvenient to his social ambitions. The reception began with cocktails on the resort's outdoor terrace, followed by dinner in the grand ballroom. The room was elegantly decorated with white flowers and gold accents, and round tables for 10 were arranged around a spacious dance floor. The Pemberton family had spared no expense, and the result was undeniably impressive. I found my assigned table and wasn't surprised to discover that Victoria had been accurate about the creative seating arrangements. My table mates included my sister Margaret and her husband, 2 elderly cousins from Trevor's mother's side of the family, and 3 couples I didn't recognize who appeared to be Pemberton family friends tasked with keeping the different types of people comfortable. One of these couples, Janet and Howard Whitman, made polite conversation during the appetizer course. "So, Desmond," Janet said, "Trevor tells us you work in manufacturing. That must be very rewarding work." "It's been good to me," I replied. "Steady employment, decent benefits, opportunities for advancement." "That's wonderful," Howard added. "There's real dignity in honest work. The country was built by people like you." They were trying to be kind, but their condescension was obvious. I was the noble working man, the salt-of-the-earth father who had raised a son capable of joining their social circle. They were patting me on the head for being authentic and unpretentious, never imagining that I was wealthier than anyone else at the table. The worst part was watching Trevor navigate the room during cocktails. He moved seamlessly between different groups, charming Victoria's family friends, networking with business contacts, and sharing inside jokes with his groomsmen. When he occasionally stopped by tables that included my relatives or friends, his demeanor shifted subtly. He became more formal, more careful, as if he were managing a delicate situation rather than enjoying his wedding reception. When Trevor reached my table, he greeted everyone with appropriate warmth, but I could see the tension in his shoulders. "Dad, how are you doing? Is everything okay? Do you need anything?" He was checking on me like a host worried about a problematic guest. The boy I'd raised, the man I'd educated and supported for 33 years, was treating me like an obligation to be managed. "I'm fine, Trevor. It's a beautiful reception. You and Victoria should be very proud." "Thanks, Dad. I really appreciate you being here." The phrase hit me like a physical blow. He appreciated me being there, as if my attendance at my own son's wedding was a favor I was doing him rather than my right as his father. After Trevor moved on to the next table, Margaret leaned over and whispered, "Desmond, I don't like how he's treating you. This isn't the boy we raised." "No," I agreed quietly. "It's not." The final humiliation came during the formal dinner service. The evening's program included several speeches from family members and close friends. Victoria's father spoke eloquently about the importance of family tradition and the joy of welcoming Trevor into their family. Victoria's brother gave a funny and touching speech about childhood memories and adult achievements. Trevor's best man delivered the expected combination of embarrassing college stories and heartfelt sentiment about friendship and loyalty. Trevor himself gave a speech thanking both families for their support and expressing his love for Victoria. But when the opportunity came for father of the groom remarks, Trevor conspicuously skipped over me. Instead, he invited Harrison Pemberton III to speak again about the importance of mentorship and guidance in a young man's life. I sat at my table, watching my son publicly declare that his new father-in-law was more worthy of recognition than the man who had sacrificed everything to make this moment possible. The slight was so obvious that several people at my table shifted uncomfortably, unsure whether they should acknowledge what had just happened. Margaret reached over and squeezed my hand. "Desmond, this is unacceptable." "It's educational," I replied quietly. "I'm learning exactly what I mean to my son." That's when I knew it was time to deliver the speech Trevor hadn't invited me to give. I stood up slowly, walked to the front of the ballroom, and approached the microphone that Trevor had just abandoned. The room fell silent as 300 guests realized that something unscripted was about to happen. Trevor's face went white when he saw me approaching the microphone. Victoria looked confused and slightly panicked. Harrison Pemberton III appeared to be calculating whether he should intervene to prevent whatever social catastrophe was about to unfold. I took the microphone and looked out at the assembled crowd, Trevor's new social circle, Victoria's wealthy family, and the working-class relatives who had been relegated to the back tables. "Good evening, everyone. For those who don't know me, I'm Desmond Chole, Trevor's father." Polite applause rippled through the room, but I could feel the tension building. "I wasn't invited to speak tonight, but I hope you'll indulge me for a few minutes. There are some things I'd like to share about my son, and about the importance of family." Trevor started to stand, probably planning to intervene, but I raised my hand to stop him. "Please, Trevor. Let your father finish." The authority in my voice, the tone I used when managing 200 employees at Riverside Manufacturing, caused him to sit back down. "I want to start by congratulating Trevor and Victoria on this beautiful wedding. No expense has been spared, and the result is truly impressive. The flowers, the venue, the dinner, everything has been first class." More polite applause, but the guests could sense that something significant was coming. "Trevor, I'm proud of the man you've become. Your education at Northwestern, your successful career in financial consulting, your ability to move confidently in social circles like this one, all of it represents achievement that should be celebrated." Trevor relaxed slightly, thinking I was delivering a conventional father of the groom speech. But I think it's important for everyone here to understand how these achievements were made possible. Because success doesn't happen in a vacuum, and the opportunities that launched Trevor's career didn't appear magically. Now the room was completely silent. Even the wait staff had stopped moving. For 33 years, I worked double shifts, overtime hours, and weekend assignments to provide Trevor with every advantage I could give him. I drove used cars so he could attend private school. I lived in a modest house so he could graduate from Northwestern debt-free. I wore department store clothes so he could dress like the successful professional he wanted to become. I could see people at Trevor's table beginning to look uncomfortable. This wasn't the kind of speech they were expecting at a country club wedding. And you know what? I was happy to make those sacrifices. That's what fathers do for their children. We work hard, we save money, we postpone our own dreams so our kids can achieve theirs. Trevor was staring at me with a mixture of confusion and growing dread. He had no idea where this speech was heading, but he could sense that his carefully orchestrated evening was about to change direction. But here's what I've learned over the past few months. Sacrifice without gratitude becomes exploitation. Love without respect becomes servitude. And supporting someone who's ashamed of you becomes a form of self-destruction. Gasps and whispered conversations erupted at tables throughout the ballroom. Victoria had gone pale, and Harrison Pemberton III was conferring urgently with his wife. Trevor, I overheard your conversation with Victoria 2 weeks ago. The one where you discussed how embarrassing I am, how I don't fit in with your new social circle, how you'll need to limit my involvement in your life after the wedding. Trevor stood up abruptly. Dad, please? Sit down, son. You've had 33 years to show me respect. Give me 5 minutes to explain what that disrespect has cost you. The force of my voice, backed by 4 decades of authority as a business owner, caused Trevor to sit back down immediately. Victoria, I also heard your comments about different types of people, and how I needed to be seated strategically so I wouldn't embarrass your family's business associates. Victoria was now crying softly, probably from humiliation rather than remorse. So let me share some information that might change how you think about the embarrassing factory worker you've been managing tonight. I reached into my jacket and pulled out a thick envelope containing documents that Bernard Hawkins had prepared. Trevor, I had prepared a wedding gift for you. A trust fund worth $2.8 million, invested conservatively but with growth potential that would have provided you and Victoria with financial security for the rest of your lives. The room erupted in shocked murmurs. Trevor's face showed a mixture of disbelief and dawning horror. I also purchased a lakefront property on Lake Erie, a vacation home worth $650,000 with private beach access and a boat dock. The deed was ready to be transferred to you tonight. Victoria's tears had stopped. She was staring at me with the focused attention of someone recalculating their entire financial future. But here's the thing about gifts, Trevor. They're expressions of love and respect. When someone shows me contempt while expecting my generosity, I have to question whether they deserve what I was planning to give them. I tore the envelope in half, letting the documents flutter to the floor of the ballroom. That trust fund will instead be donated to the Riverside Manufacturing Educational Foundation, which provides scholarships to children of working-class families, kids whose parents sacrifice everything to give them opportunities, just like I did for you. Trevor was on his feet again, his face flushed with panic and anger. Dad, you can't. This isn't. We need to talk about this privately. Privately? I laughed bitterly. Like the private conversations you've been having about how embarrassing I am? Like the private plans you made to exclude me from your new life? No, Trevor. You chose to humiliate me publicly so you can face the consequences publicly. I pulled out a second set of documents, the ones that would destroy any remaining illusions Trevor had about his father's place in the social hierarchy. But wait, there's more. Since you and Victoria seem so concerned about social status and business connections, let me share something that might interest the Pemberton family and their associates. Harrison Pemberton III was now standing, probably preparing to intervene before this disaster could get any worse. Harrison, I believe you mentioned earlier that you weren't familiar with Riverside Manufacturing. Let me introduce myself properly. I'm not just a factory worker at Riverside Manufacturing. I'm the owner and CEO of Riverside Manufacturing. The silence that followed was so complete I could hear the air conditioning system in the ballroom. For 43 years, I've maintained a modest lifestyle while building a business that generates $180 million in annual revenue. We employ 1,200 people across 3 states and hold contracts with major automotive manufacturers throughout the Midwest. Victoria was staring at me like I was speaking a foreign language. The concept of a working-class man who was secretly wealthy didn't fit into her understanding of how the world worked. Harrison, I believe your company, Pemberton Holdings, manages some commercial real estate in the Toledo area. You might be interested to know that Riverside Manufacturing owns the industrial park where your main tenant, Midwest Logistics, operates their distribution center. Harrison Pemberton III was now sitting down heavily, probably calculating the business implications of what I'd just revealed. In fact, Harrison, I believe Pemberton Holdings has been trying to negotiate a lease renewal with the unknown property owner for the past 6 months. Congratulations, you've just met him. I turned back to Trevor, who was standing frozen beside his new wife. Trevor, the simple factory worker you've been ashamed to introduce to Victoria's business associates, controls the commercial lease that generates about 30% of your new father-in-law's annual revenue. The power dynamics in the room had shifted so dramatically that people were openly staring and whispering. The Pemberton family's guests were processing the fact that the embarrassing working-class relative was actually wealthier than anyone else in the room. But here's the beautiful irony, son. All those business contacts you've been networking with tonight, all those potential opportunities at Pemberton Holdings that you discussed with Victoria, they all depend on maintaining a good relationship with Riverside Manufacturing. I walked closer to Trevor's table, where he stood beside Victoria like a defendant awaiting sentencing. Which means they depend on maintaining a good relationship with me. The embarrassing father you plan to gradually exclude from your life. Trevor tried to speak, but no words came out. Victoria was crying again, this time with the desperate tears of someone watching their carefully planned future collapse in real time. So here's what's going to happen. The lease renewal that Pemberton Holdings has been negotiating will not be approved. I'll be finding a new tenant for that property, someone who values family loyalty and treats working people with respect. Harrison Pemberton III was now pale and shaking. The loss of that lease would be financially devastating for his company. Trevor, you're a smart young man with a good education and professional skills. I'm sure you'll do fine building your own career without the advantages you were expecting from your new family connections. I turned to address the entire room one last time. Ladies and gentlemen, I want you to remember something. Success comes in many forms, and wealth doesn't always announce itself with expensive clothes or exclusive addresses. The person you dismiss as insignificant might be the person whose respect you need most. I walked back toward the exit, leaving behind the wedding reception that had revealed my son's true character and priorities. Trevor, I called over my shoulder, when you're ready to have a conversation about family loyalty and mutual respect, you know where to find me. But until then, you'll be building your life without the financial foundation I spent 40 years creating for you. I left the Maumee Bay Resort for the last time as Trevor Chole's father. The October air was cold and clean, carrying the scent of Lake Erie and the promise of a new beginning. The next morning, I called Bernard Hawkins to finalize the legal changes I'd announced the night before. The trust fund was officially redirected to the Educational Foundation, the lakefront property was donated to a children's charity, and the commercial lease with Pemberton Holdings was terminated according to the contract terms that allowed for non-renewal without cause. Within a week, the story had spread throughout Toledo's business community. The revelation that the humble factory supervisor was actually a multimillionaire business owner created waves that reached far beyond the immediate family drama. Harrison Pemberton III called my office 3 times, but I refused to take his calls. His company's financial difficulties became public knowledge when they failed to secure alternative commercial space for their primary tenant. Trevor attempted to contact me numerous times over the following months. His messages evolved from anger to confusion to desperate attempts at reconciliation. But I'd learned something important about my son's character, and that knowledge couldn't be unlearned. Victoria filed for divorce 8 months after the wedding. When Trevor's expected financial advantages failed to materialize and his career prospects dimmed, she apparently decided he was no longer a worthwhile investment. Today, 2 years later, I live in a beautiful home overlooking Lake Erie, the same lakefront property I'd originally planned to give Trevor. I retired from active management of Riverside Manufacturing but remain the majority owner. The company continues to prosper under professional management that shares my values about treating employees with dignity and respect. The Riverside Manufacturing Educational Foundation has provided scholarships to 47 students from working-class families. Each scholarship comes with a letter explaining the importance of gratitude, family loyalty, and remembering where you came from as you build success. Trevor eventually found work with a smaller financial consulting firm in Cleveland. We exchanged Christmas cards and brief phone calls on birthdays, but our relationship never recovered from the truth that was revealed at his wedding reception. I don't feel anger or bitterness toward my son. I feel something more complex, sadness for what we lost and peace from finally living authentically. The most unexpected consequence of that wedding night was discovering who my real family actually was. Margaret and Robert never questioned my decision to withdraw Trevor's inheritance. "You gave that boy every advantage in life," Margaret told me a week after the wedding. "If he chose to throw it away for social status, that's his loss, not yours." The most profound change in my life has been learning to distinguish between family by blood and family by choice. Trevor will always be my son and I'll always love him. But he's no longer part of my inner circle, that group of people whose opinions matter and whose needs take priority. 3 years after the wedding disaster, I received an unexpected phone call from Harrison Pemberton III. His real estate business had struggled after losing the Riverside manufacturing lease, and he'd been forced to sell assets and downsize his operations. "Desmond," he said, his voice carrying none of the condescension I remembered from our previous interactions, "I was hoping we could meet for lunch. I owe you an apology." We met at a quiet restaurant in downtown Toledo, where Harrison looked older and humbler than the arrogant man I'd encountered at Trevor's wedding. "I want you to know that I've learned something important over the past few years," he began. "I judged you based on appearances and assumptions, and I was completely wrong. You handled that situation with more class than I would have shown." Harrison went on to explain that losing the commercial lease had forced him to examine his business practices and personal values. "I realized I'd been treating people like commodities, including my own family." Victoria's divorce from Trevor was a wake-up call about what happens when relationships are based on financial advantage rather than genuine connection. I listened politely, but I didn't feel vindicated by his apology. Harrison Pemberton III had learned an expensive lesson about respect and character, but it was a lesson he should have learned decades earlier. "I appreciate you telling me this, Harrison," I said when he finished, "but I hope you understand that some consequences can't be undone. My relationship with Trevor, your family's financial difficulties, Victoria's failed marriage, these are the natural results of choices we all made." Harrison nodded sadly. "I understand. I just wanted you to know that I recognize what kind of man you are, and I'm sorry it took losing everything for me to see it." The conversation reinforced something I'd learned over the past 3 years. People often don't value what they have until they lose it. Trevor didn't appreciate my support until it was withdrawn. Harrison didn't respect my character until it cost him financially. Victoria didn't recognize Trevor's worth until his expected advantages disappeared. But by then it was too late for apologies to matter. 5 years after the wedding, I received a letter that brought the story full circle. It came from Trevor, handwritten on simple stationery without any corporate letterhead or professional embellishments. "Dad," the letter began, "I know this is long overdue, but I need to tell you that I understand what happened at my wedding, and I know that I was wrong. Not just wrong about how I treated you that night, but wrong about everything I prioritized during those years." Trevor went on to explain that his divorce from Victoria had forced him to examine his values and priorities. His career struggles had taught him the difference between authentic relationships and networking connections. His financial difficulties had reminded him of the security he'd taken for granted when my support was available. "I lost more than money when I lost your respect," he wrote. "I lost the most important relationship in my life, and I lost it because I was too arrogant and short-sighted to appreciate what I had." The letter continued for 3 pages, detailing Trevor's recognition of his mistakes and his genuine remorse for the pain he'd caused. He didn't ask for forgiveness or financial reconciliation. He simply wanted me to know that he finally understood the magnitude of what he'd thrown away. "I see now that you weren't just my father," Trevor concluded. "You were my example of what a man should be, hardworking, loyal, principled, and generous with people who deserved it. I failed to live up to that example, and I'm sorry." I read the letter 3 times. He sounds sincere. The question is whether sincerity is enough to rebuild what was broken. Sometimes the most painful lessons create the most meaningful legacies. The inheritance one ungrateful son threw away became the foundation for opportunities that will benefit grateful families for generations. That's real success. That's authentic family. And that's justice served with dignity. Have you ever had family members treat you with disrespect despite your sacrifices for them? How would you handle discovering that the people you've supported for years see you as an embarrassment? Do you think public exposure is justified when private ingratitude affects multiple relationships? Let me know in the comments what you think about Desmond's decision to withdraw his son's inheritance so dramatically. And don't forget to like and subscribe to Revenge Galore for more stories where justice hits hard and betrayal never goes unpunished.